really, really excited about the next two guests. Damon Klotz, who is joining us today from Culture Amp. If you've experienced Damon's podcast, you'll be very familiar with him, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to. And then Dr. Kate Daly, who leads Unmind's psychology team, who's also joining us. And Kate was out in Australia a little bit earlier in the year. Many of you had an opportunity to meet her. She's joining us this evening from the US. So we thank you for joining us in your evening. I'm going to hand it over to you two, and everybody, please enjoy the next 30 minutes, and there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Kate, I'm not sure about you. I've got some background envy after watching Yasmin do that session with the beautiful candles and plant. I'm thinking I really need to change my Zoom background. I'm not sure if you're having similar feelings.
Yeah, very much so. I'm also jealous that you're all sitting in the light while I'm sitting in the dark, but that's awesome.
Welcome to the world of virtual events and time zones. So awesome. So welcome everyone to this session where we're going to be talking about the manager's role and how they can support their teams during times of change. Because let's be honest, that's most days of the week at the moment. So if you're listening and you're a manager, you can expect to learn more about the role that you need to play and the skills that you need to support your team. And we're also going to be focusing at a higher level about what's happening with our brains, our own mental health during uncertain times. So my name is Damon Klotz, and I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Turrbal people here in Brisbane, Australia. And Unmind has kindly invited me to speak and be your host for this next session. As Matt mentioned, I work for an Australian company called Culture Amp. Hopefully some of you might have heard of it. If you have, feel free to give me a wave in the chat. It's always nice to see who I know on the call. I've been with them for over 7 years now. And actually I was based in California for the past 6 years, and I've recently relocated back to Australia. Awesome. Great to see. Thanks, Wendy, for dropping in the chat there. So during my time at Culture Amp, I've had a few different roles. I was their first head of community. I actually have a background in HR and worked in HR for several years. So I really wanted to try and build the community that I wished existed when I was at Culture Amp. And then eventually I moved into a role heading up their industry and PR team. And then most recently, I took on a role, and a very exciting role, being the host of their Culture First podcast and their work culture evangelist. So if you're at an event like this, I can assume that you'll probably love the show. Part of the session might feel like you're listening to a live podcast taping and you're going to have a front row seat. So joining me today in conversation is Dr. Kate Daly, who's the head of psychology at Unmind. Kate has an incredible background where her work has taken her from working for the NHS throughout the world in exciting places like Brazil, and even some time with the World Health Organization, who you would have heard Dr. Nick speaking about earlier. So Kate, thanks so much for joining me today. One of my favorite check-in questions to ask, and this is a question that every manager can ask during a team meeting, is if I really knew you today, what would I know?
I think what you'd know is I've just moved continents. So most of my life belongings are currently in the middle of the ocean, which is why I'm sitting in this like quite bare naked room in the dark, because I don't have all the lights and all the things I would normally have. So I think at the moment, change is like a super pertinent topic for me. So obviously, it's amazing. I've just moved from Switzerland to the US, which is such an amazing opportunity, but that's a lot of change. So like leaving friends and family and try to work out and navigate systems here, plus juggling like a lot of balls work-wise as well. So I think although it's amazing, it's also quite challenging. So if I look a bit tired or peaky, that's why. How about you? What would I know about you?
Yeah, so you're going to be giving us real life kind of feelings about change and uncertainty. And I can deeply empathize. I've spent a lot of my career as an expat. I've lived in the United Kingdom, United States, Mexico, Australia, and that constant kind of just being in environments that are a bit unknown is like equal parts exciting and also many days challenging. So I can definitely empathize with you. If you really knew me today, you'll probably know that I'm no stranger to the world of mental health. If you are familiar with any of my work, you might know that I co-founded a men's mental health charity in Australia called Spur Projects. And that was really, I created that with a bunch of mates here in Australia after my father was diagnosed with severe depression in my late teens. And his depression and multiple suicide attempts ended up having a massive ripple effect on my immediate and wider family. And, Dr. Nick was speaking earlier about this idea of, prevention. And I think for me, I saw a lot of what had happened to my family. I couldn't necessarily change the ripple effects that were happening, but I thought if there was something that could have happened earlier on that could have maybe got us into a different situation where my dad had support earlier on in his life that didn't lead to that sort of severe depression, then my entire life could have been very different. So I focused my efforts with that charity on suicide prevention for Australian men. We created a campaign called Soften the F Up, which eventually became a social enterprise called Spur Projects, which recently celebrated its 10-year anniversary. So big fan of the topic of mental health. I talk about it a lot on the Culture First podcast. And yeah, we're going to be talking about some big concepts today. I'm also a really big believer in small steps, whether it's mindfulness, breathing, yoga, meditation. Big shout out to my multiple therapists I've had over the years. I think they're all really powerful ways to, focus on our own mental health. So that's a little bit about us. We're going to get started. So Kate, my first sort of questions for you, and the way this is going to work, you're going to hear from Kate, you're going to hear from me, and then we're sort of going to join each other in conversation. We're going to be interviewing each other in this mock podcast. So I think before we dive into all the things that managers, should or shouldn't be doing when it comes to supporting their mental health of their teams, it's really important to start at a higher level and lay a foundation for this conversation. So, this is a chance for the audience here listening either live or afterwards to get a real masterclass from you as the head of psychology for Unmind. So for this segment of our podcast episode, I thought it'd be really useful for me to pretend that I know nothing about mental health and just start at the basics.
So in terms of mental health, I think the stock answer is it's our emotional, our psychological and social well-being. But I think just going really back to basics, it's just like how we feel and how we're thinking about things and how we're just kind of coping or not coping day to day. I think it's really important not to get too tangled up in the definition and just, keep it simple, I think.
And then obviously mental health gets spoken a lot about. And is there a part of mental health that you wish, more people understood?
Yeah, I think obviously as a clinician, I talk a lot about mental health problems, but I think it's really important to recognize that it's much more than mental health problems. So we talked a lot during particularly COVID about languishing. So, when people just feel kind of very low in energy or they just don't feel great. So they haven't necessarily got a mental health problem, like a diagnosable problem, but they're also not feeling that good either. And so it's really about kind of addressing mental health as a whole, and helping people kind of move from that state of languishing to flourishing, as well as addressing problems. So what we talk about at Unmind is it's not just about mental health isn't just about the 1 in 4 or the 1 in 5, depending on which stats you use, but it's about the 4 in 4 and the 5 in 5. So really thinking about mental health as this sort of really positive, aspirational thing that we can kind of aspire towards and celebrate as well. So just getting out of the language of it just being about problems, although obviously they're also really important to address.
I love that, because it kind of reminds me about that mindset as well, of shifting from this idea of mental health is only something that you think about when something's gone wrong, or when you've already said that, I'm being diagnosed with something, and more so something that everyone can be tapping into every single day, because we all have mental health, and a lot of this is around doing things that help us to get from a preventative perspective as well. I know that we're going to be talking a lot about change and how we respond to it as well. I'm just always fascinated by this topic, and I wonder if you could share anything with the audience about actually, when we're experiencing change, a lot of change management stuff we talk about is about the business of change, but what's actually happening to our brain and our body when we're experiencing change.
Yeah, so I want to caveat this with, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I might butcher this completely. But if you think about change, so our brain loves certainty. It kind of reduces the energy and cognitive load. So it always likes shortcuts and likes kind of autopilot, knowing what we're doing. Whereas change kind of unsettles that. So you don't have that certainty and predictability. And I think with that then comes, obviously you happen to think of a lot more and weigh a lot up. So it's quite exhausting, but also not knowing what's happening can feel quite threatening. So that's when we can feel anxiety, and we'll have that anxiety reaction in our brain. So things like we can't focus as much, or we can't concentrate, we can't make decisions as easily, as well as just that kind of, I suppose, Groundhog Day of just feeling absolutely exhausted with this just constant change after change after change. So I think it just has so many impacts on us kind of physically, but also emotionally as well, I think.
I know for me personally, I experienced a lot of that during the pandemic when I was living overseas and trying to work out could I get back to Australia? Could I not get back to Australia? Every day the information was changing. The borders were open, the borders were shut. There was flight, there was no flight. I had a work visa, I didn't. And like, so much of my capacity was just like trying to process all of this change that was happening. And, you know, I guess for me, that was a lot of the external factors of change. Like I felt like the change was happening to me.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference between how we cope with change if it's something that we're trying to change, like we're trying to actually implement a change, versus an external factor, like I was saying, where it's just like happening to someone?
Yeah, I think there probably is. So if you're thinking of a change that's sort of external, it can feel very like outside of your control. So I think naturally there's more anxiety because you feel like there's less that you can do about it. But I would say that kind of internal change, so in my kind of silly example of moving continents, that's a lot of change. It's very much self-inflicted, like that's my decision. But that doesn't make it any easier. So maybe you're a bit more prepared and you can put coping strategies in place a bit quicker. But I think it still impacts you, like regardless whether it's internal or external change. It's just external might be a little bit more tricky because of the unpredictability, I think.
I think the big lesson there is be kind to yourself, even if you're the one trying to implement the change. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier.
Yeah, 100%. I think even positive change can be challenging. So
yeah. So obviously there's going to be a lot of people listening to this call who are a manager, who may be leading a team, and we're going to really focus on that persona and about how to really help managers. So I'd love to learn more about your role. You know, we are the session with probably two of the most interesting job titles at this conference today, with being a work culture evangelist and head of psychology. So in your role, how are you directly helping managers and employees right now?
yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I have my fingers in a lot of pies at the moment, so I'll try and be concise. In Unmind, my role is kind of ensuring the clinical quality, so quality assurance of everything we're doing, but that can involve like writing content, whether that's sort of self-help content or in the moment tools to, you know, take the edge off some of the things people are feeling. We also encourage people to kind of monitor and track how they're feeling, so that if you notice that you're feeling a particular way, you're more likely to intervene a bit sooner. So, and we also like signpost to therapy for those who need it. So that's kind of what we've been doing for a long time. That's like our bread and butter, if you like. And I've been there since 2018 in some shape or form. But what we're now doing is kind of recognizing that that's not enough. And that focus on the individual, whilst that's really, really helpful and really important, if they're in a really toxic environment, it's just not going to make that difference. So actually we need to take this, as Matt said earlier, whole organization approach. So in doing that, my role's moved more into that space. So working particularly at the moment with managers, doing lots of research to kind of spot their pain points, their struggles, kind of what they're going through and what they need help with. And then designing training courses to kind of upskill them, to give them the knowledge and the practical tools, but also the confidence to kind of go out there and make some of these changes as well. Because I think we know that employees are just so important. They're in this really key part of the organization. So we really need to make sure we get that right to begin with. So that's where our focus has been. Yeah, as I say, a lot of pies, a lot of challenges, but kind of a fun thing to be doing. I think it's my turn to like flip it around and attempt to be a podcast host, which is definitely not my skill set. So hands up on that.
Here we go. I'm ready.
So you did a series at the start of the pandemic to help employees work through kind of the uncertainty that was going on then. And you'd be pleased to know, as promised, I did binge listen to all of them, all 7. If anyone hasn't listened to those, I definitely recommend checking them out because they were really good. And what really stood out to me there was the similarity to now. So I was listening to this all this time later, and you were talking a lot about COVID and hybrid working, but all of the same like feelings and the same strategies kind of really still applied and were still super relevant. So like it hasn't dated at all. So I just wondered, from that series of 7, was there any that really stood out to you as, you know, helping managers through this second time, if you like?
Yeah, I kind of joked with people that I was I was doing like a testing. I was like a live guinea pig for like working through the pandemic, where we were trying to, you know, I used to host this podcast in person and go to conferences and speak. And then I was like, had to pivot to virtual, recording it from my apartment in San Francisco. And I was basically just trying to understand the experience that we were all having as we tried to work through the year 2020. but I wanted to do it in a way that the content could be evergreen for people to listen to at a different time. So I'm glad that that really resonated with you. I think if I look back at, I've probably interviewed 50 or 60 people across 30 plus episodes. I'd be very remiss if I didn't shout out some of the star guests I've had a chance to speak with. So there was people like Simon Sinek and Esther Perel, who are like uber famous in the people and culture space, but also really different thinkers like poets like Cleo Wade and activists like Ray McKesson. So I think the foundation of the show has always been with accessing amazing people who help us put culture first. I think what stood out to me about trying to do a series called Working Through It during the pandemic was that I wanted to really focus on, I guess, stuff that maybe it felt like there was conversations happening in the workplace that didn't happen for a long time that I thought were really important. And I wanted to find language around some of those ones. So one of the episodes that stood out to me was with a lady named Dr. Kelsey Crowe. She's got a PhD. She's this incredible author. And she wrote this book called There Is No Good for This: What to Do and Say When Life is Scary, Awful, and Unfair to the People You Love. Now, I just want to let that title sit with people. Like, how could you not want to go read that book? There is no good part for this: what to do and say when life is scary, awful, and unfair to the people you love. I feel like we experienced that during the pandemic. We experienced that with our colleagues. If you were a part of a company that had layoffs, you were like, this is unfair. Why couldn't it, like, why was it that person? This is scary. This is awful. We just didn't know how to talk about these things. So that book had me at hello. And, bringing those topics up, I think, was really important, because when I think about change, if you're familiar with like above the line and below the line responses, my above the line response to change is that change is opportunity. My below the line response to change is that change is about grief. It's about loss. It's about wishing something could go back to how it used to be, all with this knowledge that like it can't and it won't. And I think that episode really like stuck with me, because I'm like, we don't talk enough about grief and loss in the workplace. I used to go into an office every single day, be surrounded by all my amazing colleagues. And then one day I was just like, I just didn't see those people anymore. I lost a huge part of my work experience. So, I think talking about change like this with the power of like deeply talking about your emotions in the workplace, to me, that's humanity at work. Having leaders who are willing to talk about that is the type of leaders I want to be surrounded by. So I think the experience that we went through during the ongoing pandemic allowed us to bring a lot of these emotions and conversations into the workplace. And I think for many different reasons, for a long time, organizations really just didn't make space for them.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that theme just kind of really came through in all of the episodes. I think it really tied things together. And even now, I think it's just so important and still so there. But just that idea of being human, I think sometimes it does go back to those basics, but those basics aren't always in place, I think, in some scenarios. And I did hear, I was going to ask you specifically around, you talked about the ripple effect of managers not being supported. So why do you think managers kind of might feel like they're at breaking point? I guess you're tapping into the idea of emotional contagion, which was a really interesting theme.
Yeah, emotional contagion and any type of contagion has been the type of conversation we've been having for a few years now, both from a societal and from a workplace perspective. I think one of the things as being a work culture evangelist, which is a completely made up job title, is that every year I need to sit down and write predictions for LinkedIn content. It's a part of being a work culture evangelist. You need to write things down in a list of ideally 10. So, but in all seriousness, one of the 10 that I wrote down for the year 2022 was I was just really spending a lot of time thinking about the manager, and I was really worried about how much they had taken on, how much they've been holding, how many of the emotions that I just spoke about they brought into their teams and their one-on-ones. And maybe they felt like they needed to make space for these conversations, but maybe they weren't trained on how to have a lot of those conversations. Managers were like, oh, like, one day I was talking to you about your OKRs. Next week, I felt like a licensed therapist, or an unlicensed therapist, rather. All these people are dealing with all these things that are like, oh, like I'm trying to homeschool my kids, or I'm moving house, or this has changed, or we don't have enough space. They just started to take on all these extra things. I was just really worried that there wasn't enough support. And when I thought about the ripple effect, it was basically that if these managers inside of our companies, they reach that breaking point or that burnout, for them to look after themselves, they might leave. And I was like, okay, that's really important that they need to look after themselves, but who's left behind? And that was the ripple effect about that change that I was really thinking about, is that there was going to be a team who had been, felt safe and secure by having a manager who supported them. And to have someone come in who doesn't have any of that background story, doesn't have any of that context, I just really worried about that ripple effect of every other member of that team going, I've lost the container, I've lost this person who helped me feel supported. And I was just really starting to think that, we need to really focus on benefits on what those managers are going through right now.
Yeah, definitely. That resonates so much. I think so much was put on managers that maybe didn't have some maybe did have the knowledge and the skills, but didn't necessarily have the confidence, or were a bit afraid, but also juggling all their own stuff as well. I also must say you do have an awesome job title, just coming back to the point you said at the start. I think that's amazing. So in terms of change management, then, kind of talking more about change, one of the main things people talk about is communication, isn't it? So do you have any thoughts on how little or how much managers should kind of communicate change to their team? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think when times are uncertain, it can be the default to turn on transparency mode. And I don't always think that is the right thing to do. So it's like, all right, we've got macro environments, we've got societal pressures, we've got internal pressures. And it's like, all right, I'm just going to tell you everything that's going on. And it's like, straight away, like the overwhelm of just like having a manager come in and just like unload full transparency. It's like, if you've already got employees who are like, I'm a little bit stressed, I'm a little bit anxious right now, I'm feeling like I don't really understand what's happening. The last thing you want to do is just bombard them with all this additional context, which might not be relevant to their role. And I actually spoke to Rachel Botsman, who's one of the world's leading experts on trust and a professor at the University of Oxford. And we had this really interesting debate on our episode where we spoke about this idea of rethinking transparency. Like she actually said, like, transparency should not be a value. Like, transparency is something that you need to know when to turn on, when to turn off, like what is the right amount of information, what context does your employee need right now in order to help them get through this next moment. So I think one thing during this time of change is that, like, don't tell everyone like every financial metric about what's happening with the company. Don't like tell everyone that like we've got 2 months runway. Because like some people get like, I gotta know what 2 months runway means, and other people have no idea. So if you start freaking out employees who don't have the same level of context, it's a really quick way to create this kind of like fear and uncertainty. So I think the right information at the right time, at the right level, communicated effectively, is actually what I would like managers to be doing, as opposed to blanket transparency.
Yeah, and something about that communication just being really clear as well is so important. In terms of like sharing, so we hear a lot at the moment about leaders are recommended and managers to like share a bit about their own experience of mental health or how they're doing. And I'm always in two minds with that. And I think some people do kind of sometimes maybe overshare, and then other people don't share at all. What would your advice be to managers right now in terms of what they should be doing, if there is a should?
Yeah, one of the words that I've become, I guess, infamous for using, and I've already used it once in this session, is this idea of a container. And I think like the right emotions in the right container is really important. So if you think about, a company meeting and all the different examples that we have, there is the company all hands. That is vastly different to a finance department meeting compared to a team meeting compared to a one-on-one. You don't want your company all hands to be full of too many really high emotions and like all of that kind of you need the psychological safety of the one-on-one with your manager. You want to know that your leaders are kind of like, we build here, then we build here, then we build here. So I think understanding what emotions need to be in play at what meeting, like I said earlier, around that idea of having the right context. For me, the one-on-one is sacred. I think it's like one of the most important parts of our experience at work. Having open, honest, regular conversations with the person that you report to. To me, there needs to be the highest level of psychological safety between those two people. You want to see real emotion from that manager, and you want to know that that there is trust and you feel supported. What you don't want to see is those emotions potentially being leaked into a wider team meeting where you weren't ready to share some of those things, or your manager shouldn't be sharing those things to a wider team meeting into that, those wider contexts. So I think, I'm not saying that leaders shouldn't use their emotions in the wider company meeting, but we need to make sure that anything that kind of gets, pushed up through an organization, there's actually, I guess, approval, right? So I think that's one of the things that's really important. Right emotions during the right containers, that there's that trust.
Yeah, I really like the idea of containers. I think it's interesting as well, isn't it? With that, I think that one-to-one is so important, and really, like, as a manager, prioritizing that, even if you're really busy, just like having that focus, not, you know, being distracted, and just being real, like you said before, like being human. And something about having some guardrails. Like, I think, like I said, people are sharing a lot of their story, and just making sure that they're also aware of the implications of what they're sharing. Because I think sometimes if a leader's pushed to share something, they might overshare, like you say, and actually maybe that's not helpful to them or to other people. So making sure it's also like what the manager feels comfortable in, and just kind of thinking about that and not feeling forced to kind of bare your soul if that's not kind of the person you are. So thinking about, I guess, my last question around change. So change can, as we said, like cause a lot of fear in the team. And you mentioned psychological safety. How should a manager work on that to sort of try and get ahead, if we can do that, of all this change?
Yeah, so I think we've spoken about the term psychological safety a couple of times, so I think it gets mentioned a lot, but maybe everyone here has a different, I guess, interpretation of what it is. So I think when we think about at the team level, so your manager and the colleagues, at the team level, at Culture Amp, we define psychological safety as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And I think one of the things that managers can do if they want to really understand what is the level of psychological safety with the team is that you can actually measure some of those things using something like Culture Amp, or if you have some way to gather feedback from your employees. So to give you an example here, there's a couple of questions that you could be using to measure psychological safety levels, and then you can actually compare them across teams and departments and locations. So the questions that I would encourage people to think about, if you're a leader, is you can ask the question: people are comfortable speaking up when our manager is in the room. The second one is, when my teammates say they'll do something, they follow through with it. And the third one is that if you make a mistake at this organization, it is rarely held against you. And these questions stand out to me because I think they all relate to fear and uncertainty. The first question about speaking up when the manager is in the room is really tied to whether your team feels comfortable asking important questions during a team meeting. Think about things like how the geopolitical landscape right now impacts our organization. Are they comfortable asking questions like, does a recession mean that our jobs are safe? No team member is going to feel very comfortable asking those if the team doesn't have a high level of psychological safety. The second question about teammates following through really is about trust. When things are hard and times are changing, you really want to know that you can trust your team in order to get things done and support you. No one wants to feel like they're going into these things alone and that they don't have anyone side by side with them. And then, the final one about making mistakes is really about performance and creativity. So if you're a manager and a leader, if the operating environment is tense, I guess, do you want your team playing safe? Do you want to have a team where they're not willing to stick their necks out and maybe try to do something different? Or are they going to keep doing the same thing? When times are tough, it's actually creativity that I think we need the most. We need to find solutions to new things. We have uncertain environments that we're operating in, and we need those solutions. So, what got us to here might not necessarily get us to that next spot. So, that final question is really about whether your ability to make a mistake will be punished, or do you have a team and a leader who's actually built a culture where it's going to be okay, but it's also encouraged? So to me, that really stands out. Ask these questions of your team, understand some of those key metrics around measuring psychological safety, because I think it's even more important when everything else around us is a bit uncertain. All right, I'm gonna swing the mic back to you. We're going to talk a little bit about managers and how they should be talking about mental health with their team. I guess this is a really important one. This is something I've spoken about on the podcast before, is about like, how do you even bring up the conversation about mental health, in a team meeting or even in a one-on-one. So what is your advice about talking about this in a weekly team meeting?
Yeah, I think it's really important to bake it in as an agenda item, actually, and to raise it, because then it becomes normal and it becomes part of the culture. I think it's only by starting to have those conversations and starting to put that into place that it really does kind of change things. And I would say, don't be afraid to ask. I think that's the biggest thing that holds people back about asking people how they are, or if you're concerned about someone raising something, or even just having this it kind of feels a bit awkward at first if you've, like anything, if you're doing it for the first time. So I would just say have an agenda item and just go for it, do it. And then the more you do it, the more comfortable it'll become. And you're just setting the scene and role modeling that actually this is something to talk about. And this is, again, coming back to being human. It kind of just makes a lot of sense to have there. So yeah, have it as an agenda item and try not to have fear around it.
Exactly. Yeah. Normalize it, show that you're willing to talk about it, know where your line is that we spoke about earlier. Like, what is that comfort level for the manager? Maybe something that gets brought up is like talking about mental health and like dealing with uncertainty in a team meeting is that you might fear maybe one of the employees on your team's their own mental health, and you want to have a more specific conversation with them about it. Do you have any advice for leaders listening about how to approach that subject?
Yeah, I think my biggest advice would probably be just be curious. So don't presume that you know how they're feeling, and just ask them, just start that conversation. Like, do it in a private space where there's just the two of you, and just ask them how they're doing. Maybe you could say, how are you feeling this morning, if that feels like a bit easier to do. And if you're unsure or you feel like this fear is holding you back, just kind of upskill and try and get confidence by having those conversations, because then it's going to be a whole lot easier. And I think you're not going to regret having the conversation, but you might regret not having the conversation. So yeah, just be curious and just be human and authentic, I think.
And then I was just looking at one of the questions that come through about comfort levels, about speaking about mental health in front of others. You know, if there is an employee where you feel like, you know what, they're not coming forward to me, or they're signaling that they might need some additional support and maybe they're not comfortable, is there anything that a manager should do to kind of really look out for those employees who might not feel very comfortable with talking about this in any of those containers?
Yeah, I think, again, if you've set this culture where it's psychologically safe, people do talk about mental health, and you have this check-in and you build this relationship, that's always going to be easier. But there might be other ways of signposting. So don't force someone to talk if they don't want to, but maybe another colleague could approach them that they're maybe closer to, or you could do some signposting to the resources that are available. So there's lots of ways you can do it indirectly as well, if maybe you feel you haven't got that relationship, or you're just kind of concerned about them. But again, it's just important to address, because you'll regret it more if you don't address it.
So as we round out this session, I've got, I guess, closing thoughts and then one final question for you. So I think after listening to this, we probably can all agree that as a society, we've all gotten used to this constant change that we find ourselves in. Like every day, week feels like there's something else to get used to. But just because we're getting used to it, I guess it doesn't mean that we're not going to keep struggling with it. And I think about this concept of change fatigue. You know, in the land of employee surveys, people often say that they're scared of surveying so often due to survey fatigue. And what we actually find at Culture is that it's not survey fatigue you have to worry about, it's lack of action fatigue. Employees just want to know what will happen on that feedback. They want to know what's going on. And I think the same can be true for how we're supporting our employees for change. Employees have become so used to being on this change train that's always moving that they might not even feel motion sickness anymore. But that doesn't mean that as managers that we shouldn't be finding ways to make it a more enjoyable experience for them and find space to talk about those conversations that we've mentioned. So I guess my final question to you is, knowing that this change is constant, do you have any final advice that you would give to managers to help their team?
Oh gosh, that's a big question to end on. I think just really, there's probably loads of different techniques, but really just holding that space for people. So there's a lot of change, there's a lot of emotions. Everyone's experience is going to be very different. So just acknowledging that this is a difficult time and listening. Like, it sounds so cliche, but I think actually that's the best tool that any manager has in their toolbox. It's just actively listening, helping that person feel heard, and then later the action. But I think that in the moment listening is kind of crucial.
I could not agree more. One of my favorite terms when I was researching podcast hosts and like different ways to like run a show, one of my favorite shows that I listen to is called On Being with Krista Tippett, and she has this term about being a generous listener. And I just think it's such a beautiful way of like, could you listen a little bit more generously? Is there a way that you could be less distracted for your team? Is there a way that you could go a little bit deeper to really listen to what's coming up for them? Ask one more question. I talk about these onion questions. So yeah, and it looks like we've got time for a question. So I've just seen one come through to me. So it's, how do you bring up well-being in a group setting versus an individual setting? Do you have any thoughts on this, Kate?
Yeah, I think just making it kind of making it not personal, and just kind of starting that conversation. You could just have a check-in of kind of, how's the team doing, or what's going well in your week, or just start off like that, and maybe sharing yourself so that other people, especially if you're the manager and leader that people are looking towards, like role modeling that, so that other people feel able to kind of open up, but also not forcing it. Like if someone doesn't want to talk in that group setting, like that's really okay. And just kind of respecting people's different boundaries and where people are at, I would think. I guess final thoughts. Do you have any thoughts on that? Throwing it back at you.
Yeah, I'm maybe because I started my career in learning and development and facilitation, I'm a really big believer in like the person who gathers people together has to be a really authoritative host during these things. And they need to make sure that they set out the guidelines in advance. So it's like, if you're going to start talking about mental health and well-being, like flag that in advance with the team. Don't like add it to the final 5 minutes of your team meeting. Like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna have a quick little check-in on all of your mental health. Let's go around the room and like make everyone do it. Like there's no quicker way to have someone want to shut down by the idea of like being forced to share emotions with 3 minutes left in a Zoom meeting. So get the agenda out in advance. Mention that it's going to be talked about, and also make it an opt-in activity. If it's going to be a group setting, I do this kind of thing. Like we're just going to popcorn around to every single person because they're just going to be sitting there like sweating bullets if they don't want to be talking about it. So I think, I think that's really important. And then at the individual level, again, just go back to the listening, and also like don't feel the need to have all the answers. A lot of it's just going to be like listening and going, I hear you, I understand that might be really hard. What can I do to support you? How can I find other ways? Are there additional resources? Work with companies like Unmind. So I think that's really critical as well. So awesome. I think that's all we have time for. Kate, deeply apologize for whatever happened at the start. Nothing like a bit of fear, change, and uncertainty during a live webinar or conference, but we got through it. We survived our live podcast taping. It was an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Over to you, Matt.
All right, thank you both so much. And if you enjoyed that conversation, I would encourage you to follow the Culture First podcast. Damon hosts that on behalf of Culture AMP, and please connect with Dr. Kate. She's such a innovative thinker, and we love having her on the team. And connect with her on LinkedIn, and we're looking forward to her next visit out to Australia as well.